Today we have Janet here with us to discuss clinical trials. I'm Lisa Goldman, one of the co-founders, along with Janet Freeman Daly over in the other square that says the ROS1ders. And today we're going to be talking about clinical trials, what's out there right now, any questions you might have. So we ask you to stay on mute just to cut down on noise issues. But if you have any questions, just go ahead and unmute yourself, ask questions at any time or put them in the chat. I'll try to keep an eye on the chat while Janet is doing her presentation so she doesn't have to do that at the same time as trying to talk.
So just a quick question, if everybody can show me on video for a moment and I get a show of hands, how many of you consider yourselves to be knowledgeable about clinical trials? Okay, I only saw 2 hands. So I'm going to cover some of the basics of clinical trials and then start talking about more details of particular clinical trials. So if you've already seen the basic stuff, please tolerate going over it again. And I will share my screen. Can everybody see the clinical trial slide? I can't see you, so I need to hear somebody say yes.
Yes, we can see.
Okay, yes. Thank you. Okay, so we're going to focus on ROS1 clinical trials today, but first we're going to talk a little bit about what a clinical trial is. So what is a clinical trial study? It either looks at a new treatment all by itself, a new treatment added to a standard of care treatment, or a new treatment either on its own or combined with standard of care compared to another treatment. And some of these studies, you can have a study that's still shown as a clinical trial, but it's actually observational rather than treatment. For instance, when they were originally trying to find out whether or not there were a lot of biomarkers in the lung cancer space, there was a trial that just did testing to see whether or not people had biomarkers. Now, sometimes they're doing tests to see whether or not a means of detecting cancer is useful, like when they're trying to do early detection with biomarker trials or other means. Some of the key terms that you want to keep in mind. One is open label, and that means that everyone in the trial knows which intervention they're getting. Randomization means that they select people to be in different groups, and those different groups receive different interventions for the purposes of comparison. And usually those are blinded, which means that you and probably your doctor don't know which of the treatments you're receiving. That's so they can make a fair judgment as to whether or not it's the actual effects or you're having effects because you think you're getting the drug. A basket trial is something that's important in ROS1 because more than one cancer can have ROS1. So a basket trial means any type of cancer or specific types of cancer other than lung cancer can also be in the trial. There's multiple cancers involved. And then there's the phases. So clinical trial phases. The way the trials differ, and we hear a lot about phase 1 and phase 2 trials in ROS1. All drugs, when they are first being tested in humans, go through a phase 1 trial. It's a small group of patients, and they're trying to see whether or not the drug is safe, and also trying to establish what's the maximum tolerable dosage. You can't progress to the other phases until you've gotten the safety data from phase 1. Phase 2 is a larger trial. It can be 50 to 70 patients, and it's looking at how effective the drug is and what side effects it might have. For when you have a disease that has a lot of people, so you have enough to staff a large trial, you might go to phase 3. That can be hundreds to thousands of people, and it's comparing 2 different treatments to see which one is more effective. Most ROS1 drugs don't undergo a phase 3 trial simply because there aren't enough of us to populate the trial. But there has been at least one trial that compared two different drugs. After phase 3 is successful, then the drug company can apply for regulatory approval. And then sometimes a drug that already has regulatory approval will have a phase 4 trial. That's done in a real world population when the drug is already out there with a lot of people and they're looking at long-term effectiveness and side effects. Normally, we just have phase 1 and 2 trials for ROS1. So some things you might want to think about before joining a trial. What are the advantages and disadvantages? The advantages are your participation and data might help us find a better ROS1 treatment, or the one that's best of the ones that are available to us. Another advantage is that the treatment you receive might be more effective and or less toxic for you than other treatment options. And the third is clinical trials for these drugs are usually held at academic cancer centers that have the best standard of care and a great support team. So you'll actually get a chance to have a higher quality of care than you might otherwise have had. Some of the potential drawbacks is you have no guarantee the treatment is going to work. If you get in a phase 3 trial and get randomized, you might not receive the experimental treatment. For the most part, that has not been something that's happening in ROS1 trials. And you also have to consider whether or not going into a trial is the best treatment option for you. If your health is not good enough, or you have particular issues, you might not meet the inclusion criteria. For instance, if your liver values are too high, you might not be able to get in. You need to think about whether you can handle the increased number of clinic visits and any potential travel and associated expenses, because trials generally don't pay for those things, but we'll talk more about that. You need, in the US, to think about whether your insurance will cover care at the particular trial site. And the trial might require a biopsy to prove that you have ROS1, and you have to think about whether or not you've got fresh tissue that can actually do that. You also want to consider what we know about this treatment. In a phase 1 trial, when it's first in humans, nobody has much information except the preclinical data that's been gathered in animal models or in the lab. But if you're in a phase 2 trial, you have the safety data and they have more information about potential side effects. If you're joining a trial of a drug that's already been approved, and it's just being trialed for ROS1 as opposed to the other condition for which it's been approved, you have even more information about it. Everyone has to decide their own risk tolerance for clinical trials. So all the information you want to learn about a particular clinical trial is available on a website called clinicaltrials.gov. You see it up there in the big red thing here. So when it comes up, you can search for trials, and what you want to do is enter ROS1 down here under conditions or disease. Then every trial you bring up will have ROS1 somewhere in the text. They won't necessarily be a treatment for ROS1, because sometimes they put in information about the drug and they say this drug has shown to have activity against ALK and ROS1, and then they don't allow ROS1 people in the trial. So you have to realize not everything it pulls up will be useful to you. There's different types of information available on clinicaltrials.gov, and we're going to walk through some of that. Right now, there are a few ROS1 TKI trials open. A TKI is short for tyrosine kinase inhibitor, which is our oral cancer drugs. The 3 primary ones are repotrectinib, which is currently in phase 2 internationally, taletrectinib, which has completed phase 1 and is now going into phase 2 internationally and has 3 sites open, and NVL 520. The reason it doesn't have a name is because it has to be proven that it's safe before they'll give it a name. This is just recently started. It's got 5 sites open in the US in phase 1. There are other trials available for TKIs and other ROS1 treatments. Unfortunately, a lot of them are in China, and we don't have a lot of visibility into that. But most of them will still be listed on clinicaltrials.gov. So let's look at some of the information you get on these trials if you go to clinicaltrials.gov. One is they'll have trial arms. And the purpose of this is to look at how effective the drug is depending on prior treatment you've had or what your situation, your health situation is. In a phase 1 trial, you see on this first line here, it says, oops, go back. Phase 1 dose escalation. We mentioned one of the things that happens in phase 1 is that they try and find the maximum tolerable dose for the drug. That's how much you can give somebody before it's just, you just can't tolerate the side effects. And they figured that more drug is better for treating cancer, which isn't always true, but that's how trials are structured. So usually they enroll people into phase 1, the dose escalation arm first, to try and find what a reasonable dose is. And sometimes your doctor may say, well, yes, the phase 1 trial is open, but you might want to wait a while because they want to find, they start out on a very low dose, and the initial doses may not be high enough to be effective. So if you don't have a real urgent need for the drug, you might want to wait until they have more information about whether or not they found an effective dose or a dose that people start reacting to. Then they have additional cohorts and they break it out to try and find out whether or not how many TKIs you've had previously affect whether or not the drug is safe or has issues. So for instance, this is the Nuvalent or NVL 520 trial. They have a cohort for people that have never had a TKI. They have a cohort for people who've had 1 prior TKI and no chemo or immunotherapy. They have a cohort for people who have 1 prior TKI and 1 line of treatment that was either platinum-based chemotherapy with immunotherapy or without. They have 1 that's had more than 2 TKIs with or without chemotherapy and immunotherapy. And then they have 1 for other solid tumors besides lung cancer that have progressed on any therapy. Now, it costs drug companies quite a bit to run these trials. So their goal is to get enough information to be able to make database decisions about each of these cohorts. But they don't want to have an infinite number of people in one cohort and not the other. So most of these cohorts have a limit as to how many people can enroll. Sometimes you'll see that a trial is open, but not enrolling because they don't have any open slots. People sometimes drop out of trials for various reasons, and that might open up a new slot. So one of the things to note about clinicaltrials.gov is that it actually, the information available on the website lags what's actually happening. So a company may submit the information and it might not get posted for a month. So sometimes there may be a slot open, even though it doesn't show on clinicaltrials.gov. And it's good to check in with the site that you're interested in participating in to learn more information. And again, I can't see anybody's hands, so if you have questions, you need to speak up. So another thing you'll find on the listing of clinicaltrials.gov is inclusion and exclusion criteria. The drug company may have found in their preclinical data that people who have a higher liver value can't clear the drug and it makes the drug toxic. So they might therefore say someone with liver values above XYZ can't participate in the trial. Most drugs tend to exclude children, but some are allowing other, see like in this one, and you see on line 1 under the inclusion criteria, they allow people ages 12 and over that weigh a certain amount to be involved in the cohort for all cancer types. You see here in phase 1, they're being more careful about some things. Typically, though, in phase 1, you might be able to get in even though you don't have a diagnosis of ROS1 confirmed by tissue, or you might be able to get in based on a test that your doctor did instead of what the trial did. And so it's important to read the inclusion criteria. There's also exclusion criteria. For instance, number 1 under the exclusion criteria, they don't allow anyone in the trial who hasn't got a primary driver of ROS1. They also might not allow people within who've had major surgery within 4 weeks or on other anti-cancer therapy right now. And that's usually you have to have a washout period to get what the previous drug was doing in your body out of your system before you try the new drug. And you also usually can't be in 2 clinical trials at the same time. Now you see a note here, the RECIST criteria. I can't remember off the top of my head exactly what RECIST acronym stands for, but this is the standard criteria used by all cancer clinical trials to judge whether or not a solid tumor is responding to a treatment. Usually during a clinical trial, they will select a number, and it's usually a small number, of tumors that they will follow specifically to look at whether or not they're growing or shrinking. And then that is used to determine whether or not the drug is having a response. I almost didn't get into the ROS1der clinical trial because my tumor was almost too small. But since it was a phase 1, they had a little more leeway, and so they decided to allow me into the trial. They might be more rigid about that in a phase 2 trial and say you have to have a tumor that's at least a certain size. So when you want to join a clinical trial, you go through an intake process where they run various tests, run scans, and they might do a heart monitor, something like that. And then all of that data is sent to the sponsor of the trial, which is usually a drug company for our oral cancer drugs. And that drug company gets the final say as to whether or not you can be accepted in the trial. So there might be a wait period involved. Then there's also different sites offering the trial. I mentioned in Nuvalent that there were 3 sites open right now. I guess I said 5, and the number's actually gone up when I ran this morning. So now it says that there are 6 sites open. And then you see others where you know you're going to have the trial, but it's not recruiting yet. That doesn't mean that those sites are secondary or less important or anything. It just, different sites take a different amount of time to go through the regulatory process they must go through to approve having a trial at their location. Also, the drug company may open 1 or 2 sites and see what initial results are before they open it elsewhere. In this case, Nuvalent opened in a few sites, but the first patient was actually dosed just last week at MSK. So that's their Memorial Sloan Kettering in New York City. So the trial has been open, but the first patient just enrolled. If you're interested in participating in a trial, it helps if you choose the location you think that you want to go to, and then you contact them and find out what the situation is, because that site, especially later in the trial, might have all of its slots taken, but they might know of other places where you could enroll in the trial. And for those who are interested, you can enroll in a trial early at one location, and then if necessary, you can change to a different location if you move. There's also lots of information about clinical trials available on clinicaltrials.gov itself. There's a page here where you go under About Studies, and it pulls up all sorts of information that you can use to learn more about clinical trials, how they're run, how patients are protected, how what you might get charged for, etc. So one thing about patient protection is every clinical trial must be approved by a regulatory body that looks at the ethics of the trial and the structure of the trial to make sure that patients will be adequately protected, both for their health and for their data and a variety of other things. In the US, that's called an IRB. That can be an institutional review board or an independent review board. They're called ethics boards in some other countries, and different countries may have other names for them, but they all have the same purpose. A group of people knowledgeable about clinical trials and about cancer take a hard look at the protocol that will be used and make sure that the patients will be protected during the trial. So that is the presentation that I have. Are there any questions that you'd like to ask? I can now see you, so speak up or raise your hand.
Janet, it's Heidi.
Hi.
You're in Hartford, not too far from Boston. I'm surprised, I guess, that the start of the trial, and we tried to get into phase 1 and we were told phase 1 wasn't right for us by Dr. Lin. So fine, we'll wait and watch. But I'm surprised at the lag time between them opening the study in what I think was maybe September, right? You're telling us the study was, taking intakes into January before the first patient's dosed. How does that cadence normally work?
It depends. In the case of Nuvalent, the first site opened at UC Irvine, I believe. But they might not have had any patients who were interested in the trial or qualified at that point. It could be that it wasn't until that the first patient who was available was close to New York City and chose that location. They have to meet the inclusion criteria, and it also depends on their situation. While Nuvalent doesn't say there's no drug that, it doesn't matter which TKI you took ahead of time, your particular doctor might know your situation or your biopsy and might say, I don't think this drug is going to work for you. It could be because the preclinical data said that it doesn't work on some type of resistance mutation, and that's what your tumor has. It could be that your blood work in some department isn't working well, or it could be that you were recently on immunotherapy and they're concerned about having a reaction to a TKI immediately afterwards. It could be that they don't want you to go through the washout period with the state your cancer's in right now. It's all very individual.
Do we run the risk that there just aren't enough ROS1 potential patients, us, to be able to get enough data to get a phase 1 and a phase 2? I mean, my sense is we've kind of joined in with other small orphaned ALKs to get some of the other drugs. So, I mean, do we run the risk of Nuvalent not coming out to us in mass because we don't have enough people to test on?
I'm not sure what you mean about joining with ALKs.
My sense is like lorlatinib, right? Which is not a ROS1 drug, but it's working on ROS1 because that was got to phase 2 through ALK clinical trials.
Okay,
That's
so
how it was explained to me. I mean,
okay.
Do we run the risk of Nuvalent not coming out?
There are only something like 30% of clinical trials actually complete accrual and get enough data to be able to get information to the FDA. And actually only about 10% of clinical trials actually get approved. There's no guarantee that it's actually going to get approved. And it is a concern that ROS1 is small enough that we don't have enough patients to support 3 clinical trials running at the same time. That's always an issue.
I didn't have that scope, so thank you.
But I also wanted to clarify that just because ALK may be getting a clinical trial for the same drug at the same time, but the FDA will not approve a drug for ROS1 based on ALK data. They have to get ROS1 data. That's one reason why lorlatinib has not been approved for ROS1 The data was in a smaller group of patients, and it wasn't as strong as the ALK data. And so Pfizer has chosen not to try and go ahead with approval for it, even though there's lots of data for ALK.
And and my sense is Pfizer's not tracking those of us on lorlatinib.
It has nothing to do with the patients on real world data. If you're getting it on compassionate use or other things, they collect data, but they have to have data collected in a certain way to take it to the FDA. And at the moment, the FDA is not structured to approve drugs based on real world data. It has to be data collected in a clinical trial. And the clinical trial data perhaps just didn't look strong enough. I think the original clinical trial data said that lorlatinib only worked in like 30% of patients. So they not only have to look at whether or not the drug works, they have to look, the FDA looks at whether or not that drug is as good as what's already out there. So, there's a variety of factors, and Pfizer has not chosen to tell us what their thinking is.
And I just want to jump in here too, because it's come up a number of times in our Facebook group that, why don't we always just partner with the ALK group, the ALK group? And that is because while some of the drugs developed for them happen, luckily, to work for us, some of them don't. Like one of their top drugs, alectinib, is not effective at all for ROS1. So we do need clinical trials that are focused on addressing ROS1 cancer, not ROS1 and ALK cancer, because that doesn't unfortunately always work. Nuvalent's drug was developed specifically for ROS1 cancer, so it's intentionally excluding anybody else, and hopefully, fingers crossed that it's going to work for us. We're optimistic.
Another aspect of the Nuvalent drug that's different than all of the trials we've had so far is that entrectinib, lorlatinib, and to some extent crizotinib all hit another biomarker called NTRK. And that is what's responsible for the balance issues and the other neurological issues and the cognitive issues, they believe. So Nuvalent developed their drug to not hit NTRK. And they're hoping that means that we won't have those side effect problems. So
I have a question. This is Lois. So is it possible, if you're doing well on one of these drugs, to decide, I want to go into the trial, and your doctor and you can get into the trial and they back you on these things? Is that a bad move, or should you wait until, I saw on your chart where if your liver counts are up or different things are happening, you might get to a point where they want to accept you into a trial. And it looked like these trials only are going to last 2 or 3 years. So my question is, should you jump ship on something that appears to be working okay for you? I'm on lorlatinib, and I'm having like the side effects of the high cholesterol. Is that something that this new drug won't have? And, the neuropathy issues and things like that, aren't so bad, but it would be nice to not have those. So, what's the answer?
So it's an individual choice. And by the way, from what I hear, the Nuvalent drug does have cholesterol problems similar to lorlatinib. So you won't necessarily avoid that. But there are several issues that arise if you choose to stop using a drug that's already working for you. One, there's no guarantee that the new drug will work.
Mm-hmm.
2, there aren't that many drugs out there. And if you stop a drug, you often can't go back to it. So you're like cutting off your options prematurely. And 3, clinical trials do limit how many TKIs you can have before you, in order to be on the trial. So they're being a little more liberal now, but there's a lot of data to indicate that the effectiveness of TKIs decreases with every TKI that you've had. So people, they had a higher response rate for people who had only one TKI than they did for people who had 2 TKIs previously, than people who've had 3 TKIs previously. So every time you switch drug, you're reducing the chances that the drug will work for you.
Also, can I jump in, Janet?
Yes.
To get into a clinical trial, you have to have measurable disease. So if your current drug is working, you probably won't have sufficient measurable disease to qualify to get into another clinical trial. So that likely isn't an option for you.
Yeah, okay.
Also, if some trials are trying to get a biomarker test approved along with their drug, so they will require you to have a new biopsy that they can use their biomarker test on, and you may not have enough tissue or accessible tissue to be able to get another biopsy. So there's several things to consider, but every time I've talked to Camage or Doble or Dr. Lin or Dr. Shaw, they all say, if a drug is working for you, don't jump. Don't stop it.
May I ask?
Sure.
Okay. Well, as I am German, I don't understand 100%. I understand you quite well, Janet. Thank you very much. But when I ask now, maybe I did not understand something.
That's fine.
I want to ask, when you were talking with Heidi about lorlatinib, you mentioned like the status of lorlatinib as if lorlatinib is something that is not read already. Well, that's what I did not understand is lorlatinib a drug which is completely, don't know the words, like a standard? Or is it still something that is on trial? Or what is the status of lorlatinib? I think you talked about that and I didn't get it.
Okay, so when I went into clinicaltrials.gov yesterday, there are some trials still listed for using lorlatinib in a few countries or in combination with other drugs. So they're still running some trials on it. But as yet, there is no country that has given regulatory approval to lorlatinib. It has been available through compassionate use. The drug company is making it available in order to get more data, but they have announced that they are no longer going to do that for any new patients. So right now, unless somebody can get into one of the lorlatinib trials that are running, and I think one's in China and a couple others, anyone who wants to start taking lorlatinib now might have a problem getting it. In the US, we're able to get it off-label with a considerable amount of effort from the doctor interacting with the drug company. But for people outside the US, we've been told that Pfizer will no longer allow new patients to start lorlatinib.
Okay, I'm getting lorlatinib from my doctors from a research group in the Uniklinikum Cologne.
This is a recent development, so there are still many people on lorlatinib.
Yeah, and I wanted also to tell you that I'm the only patient with a pancreatic cancer who is in this group, and in Cologne, there's nobody else like me having pancreatic cancer and being ROS1. So this is
also have lung cancer, or do you have 2 cancers, Anne, or only pancreatic?
No, only pancreatic cancer.
Yes, and that's what we were talking about, a basket trial, when they allow people with different kinds of cancers to take the same drug. We have had a couple of people with pancreatic cancer in the US group, but they did not take lorlatinib. So I'm glad that it's working for you.
Yeah, I had my scan yesterday and it is working. It's the tumors, I have a lot of metastasis in my liver and they are shrinking. But the problem is that I would like to share or be in contact and know something more about it, because the side effects are so unpleasant. And my fear is, talking about dosage, that if they diminish my doses now because I'm suffering of the side effects, then the cancer will grow again. That's the fear that I have, and that would be so nice to be in contact with somebody else. Yes,
I do understand that fear, and I would like to point out that Pfizer has data predominantly in lung cancer that while the starting dose for lorlatinib is 100 milligrams, there are people who found it effective at 75 and at 50 milligrams.
So, Anne, I'm at 50 milligrams and I'm 75 milligrams, and I'm just at 4 months on lorlatinib. So only 6 weeks on, 1 scan, all the tumors in my brain, I'm dispersed. And then the next scan's in February. I'm going to send you my email.
Great. You can put it in the chat and then she'll have access to it. Thank you, Heidi. Other questions?
Hello, this is Dan.
Hi, Dan.
Going back to Heidi's question about potentially having fewer patients of our group. I have a question about, I saw like for drugs like entrectinib, it potentially works on not just lung cancer, but different types of cancer as long as it's ROS1. I guess my first question is for the Nuvalent drug. Is that also the case? And the follow-up question to that is just, would that help us gain more data into the clinical trials for this drug on whether it works on, I guess, all kinds of ROS1 cancer and help gather more data and push the process forward faster? Mm-hmm.
So yes, the entrectinib trial was a basket trial for all people who had ROS1 positive cancer. They had a very tough time recruiting enough people to be able to get enough data to get a regulatory approval for it. The FDA at that point was still approving drugs by cancer type. However, gosh, it's been 2 or 3 years. The NTRK approval was for all cancers.
Okay.
Because they had enough people to be able to make that decision. And also because people with NTRK had no other treatments. So the bar for providing data at the FDA was lower. So yes, if we could get more people in from other cancer types, it would help. The problem is that most cancers are still not getting biomarker testing. They know it's big in lung cancer, but we only were able to get in the US to get our biomarker testing covered by insurance only in the past couple of years. And not all cancers have access to that. So there's a big disparity as to who we can get approved. It would help if we could get more people tested, but ROS1 still is not widely tested. It's still maybe 50% of lung cancer patients and very few others. So yes, that would certainly help us having more people available for trials, but it's an ongoing challenge. Nuvalent does have one arm of its trial, one cohort that is for people with cancers other than lung cancer. So they are also hoping to do it. But I've consulted with the drug companies on this as, just as a ROS1der, not as a paid consultant, trying to figure out how we attract more people to these trials. And it's tough.
Absolutely. Okay, got you. Yeah. And that alternative cohort is in phase 2, right? Or is that also?
No, I believe it's open in phase 1.
Phase 1. Okay, thank you.
Hi, I'm Piera and I'm in Dallas, Texas. I'm on the repotrectinib trial. It's been a year.
Good.
And yeah, just to let you, my scans yesterday were read and they're all stable. I don't have any sign of cancer after a year.
Yay, congratulations.
Yeah. So my question is being trial for different types of cancer too, or not?
Yes,
Only lung.
no, they're
Okay.
are all cancers. I don't know how many people they've had from other types of cancers enrolled though.
Okay, because they were very kind of strict to get into the study.
Yes.
Because I used Salcori before, crizotinib. And really the side effects are being, well, they've been kind of coming and going. The only issue right now is that one of the side effects is inflammation, pneumonitis, whatever they call it.
Pneumonitis, yes.
Pneumonitis. And that's the only issue right now, but it's working. So I recommend that at least for me, it works.
I'm glad it works for you. That's great.
Yeah.
So we've talked in other presentations about resistance mutations. Does everybody understand resistance mutations and how it applies to clinical trials?
And just before we jump to that, I just want to go back because there does seem to be concern about, the participation or number of ROS1 patients available for trials and whether that will thwart or hinder our ability to get new drugs. And I believe, maybe you can correct me or talk on this, Nuvalent is aware of this issue. The FDA is aware of this issue. There are many types of diseases out there that, like us, have, a small sample size, and they take that into consideration in approval. So while it is tough for us to accrue a sufficient number of people, Nuvalent didn't invest all this time and effort into this trial ignorant of that. So the FDA, may be able to approve this drug, if, knock on wood, it performs well in phases 1 and 2. They may not even require very much in terms of a phase 3. Is that correct? Or I'm not sure.
Pretty much every ROS1 drug so far in the US has been approved based on a phase 2 trial. They have not required a phase 3 because they don't, the general consensus is we don't have enough patients to populate it. Plus, a phase 3 requires that you compare 2 different drugs. So if you have a TKI that works for 80% of patients, is it actually ethical to run it against a clinical trial for, say, chemo that works for 20% of patients? So I believe Europe, in the Eurocross trial, actually compared crizotinib to a different treatment, but generally we don't have to do phase 3 trials. And you're right, Lisa, drug companies don't invest all this money when they think the trial is not going to happen. They may have to run it a few years longer than they planned in order to get enough people, but their goal is to have a successful trial that gathers enough data. So they wouldn't be going into this if they didn't think they had a good chance of doing something successful.
I think some of the problem in these trials is they're not in a lot of places. So this one is, and hopefully they'll stay there, where a lot of, people can get to them and when they need to, as the drug that you're on stops working. And that's the other question. How long does it take once you've decided, well, my drug has stopped working, I need to, go into something new? Can you do the groundwork for that and get everything ready ahead of time? Or do you just have to rush around and be so stressed and everything at the end when your drug stops working and this is your only alternative, is to try to get into here?
It depends on the trial. When I joined the crizotinib trial, they allowed me to use scans and other information that had been gathered at my home clinic in order to enroll in the trial. So I didn't have to do everything at the trial site. However, some of these companies that are creating new drugs are relatively new. Pfizer is a big company. They've been doing clinical trials forever. Their clinical trial team is really experienced. But when you have a new team of clinical operations people, they may not be as confident. And so they might be stricter. You have to do everything by the book. If you have to do everything by the book, you will probably have to have go to the trial site and use their scanners and get blood tests there, et cetera, to be able to join the trial. There are some modifications they're allowing during COVID. So it varies from site to site and trial to trial. But once you've done all of that, then there's a wait period before you get accepted into the trial, because the drug company sponsor has to look at all of your data and decide whether or not they will accept you. Once you've been accepted, there's a washout period to get off your old drug. Hopefully it's no more than a week, but they need to be able to provide data to the FDA saying it's our drug that had this effect, not some of it was from the drug they used to be on. So it's from the time you decide you want to join a trial, if you could and you say you're going to your own site and talking to your doctor who offers the trial, you don't have to worry about travel arrangements or anything else. And there's nothing delaying people going there because of COVID. You're still looking at, at least a week or two from when you make the decision until you get on the new trial.
I'll also chime in and confess that in the first few years of living with this, I drove myself a little crazy trying to keep up with every detail of where every clinical trial was and what the requirements were and whether I would qualify. And the reality is it shifts so often, slots that are open and closed and inclusion criteria or exclusion criteria. And my personal situation that I finally gave up and realized that there's really no way to prepare very far in advance for getting into a clinical trial. You just have to keep an eye on your scans. And when things, start to look like you might need to change medication, that's when you start to invest in really keeping a closer tab on the status of all the various options that you might have and where the clinical trials are. But there's not a lot we can do to stay ahead of things in advance before you even know if you have progression.
And that said, some people, if they are with a doctor that you're the only ROS1 patient and they're not always sure what to do, they might set up a remote consult with an expert or go and have a consult in person with an expert to say, this is my current treatment. What do you think? And establish a relationship with that doctor that has trials available so that when you do need a trial, you already have an in and you don't have to go through all of the stuff ahead of time. I would suggest, though, that it's really helpful to make sure that you keep copies of your scans on CD and of your scan reports and your labs, so that if you do find you need to go and get a trial, you don't have to start from scratch pulling everything together.
May I ask something?
Sure.
Me personally, well, I have been diagnosed 4 years ago, and I have a lot of very good experience with my doctors. So I tend to completely live in confidence to my doctors. And then I think, well, they will tell me how to take this drug. And then we will see on the scan when it works, and when it's not working anymore, they will know what to do. So until now, I did not research like Lynn said.
Lois.
I don't do that at all. But I would like to know from your experience, is it recommendable to to research on my own, or what do you think?
So you're at Cologne, right?
Yes.
You have ROS1 experts at Cologne. I think you can be fairly safe in knowing that there are people there who know what to do.
And it's not only, well, they said there are few ROS1 patients in Cologne, but as you know, Bärbel, Sölke and others are there.
Mhm.
And there is a network. They have a network in Germany with all the other Universitätskliniken. So they are interchanging. So if there's something to know, I always hope that my doctors will know.
Yeah. So Dr. Camage in Colorado is my doctor, and I don't feel a need to go and research because I feel he doesn't know. He always has in mind what next steps are. And if I run into a problem, he knows where to guide me. I don't worry about that. I keep up with it for the ROS1der's sake and for my own sake, but I trust that doctor. My Seattle doctor, I trust because he knows Dr. Camage and he calls him. Does that answer your question, Anna? Okay.
Janet, there's a question in the chat. Did you see?
I know Christine had one. How far back do they need scans and blood work? It depends on the doctor and the trial. I believe when I went to see Dr. Camage to get into the crizotinib trial, they just needed the most recent scans. Being the anally over prepared person that I was, I had all my past scans and he didn't want them. So, Christine, yes.
Yeah, just think about lorlatinib. In America, what's the situation overall in the lorlatinib for ROS1? Is it still going on the trial or is not?
For what, lorlatinib?
Yeah.
No, there's no trial here for lorlatinib.
Oh, so it's so the drug company is given up for the lorlatinib.
And the National Comprehensive Cancer Network, and they recommend lorlatinib as a second line or third line treatment for ROS1. Mm-hmm. And because of that recommendation, our insurance companies will cover it, although sometimes you really need to get your doctor to work it. So people in the US can obtain lorlatinib, what we call off-label. Even though it's not approved, it is approved for another cancer, and because the guidelines recommend it, the insurance will cover it. So it's available, but Pfizer isn't going after trying to get it approved.
Okay. I have seen several, like from Chinese ROS1 group, and it seems that in China, the lorlatinib is very actively trialed, in the trial. Yeah. So it seems they are like, I see, like there, I just see from the Facebook, from the Chinese Facebook, and it seems that crizotinib, and then the patient will go to the lorlatinib.
There is a lorlatinib trial in China, at least according to clinicaltrials.gov. Any other questions? Well, if we're done with the clinical trials portion, Lisa, how about we'll stop the recording and then people can just talk. Is that okay?
Yeah, sure thing. Yeah.
All right. Thank you.
Can we also